Jordan, thank you for coming on the show.
Very glad to be here. That's quite the beginning.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's very easy for people to lose track of the fact that while you're sitting in an air-conditioned space somewhere thinking about your next Netflix movie that you're going to watch, there are people that are in the most horrible and heinous situations that are being put on them by other human beings. And it doesn't really stop.
Yeah, well, it's a hard thing for people to contemplate. I mean, there's two elements to life that are hard to contemplate. I mean, one is that the suffering that's attendant on life, fundamentally, and then the other is the malevolence of people. And we're not, in the modern world, we don't really think about those as fundamental realities in some sense, you know, because we tend to think about material situations as fundamental realities, but the metaphysical realities, the ethical realities are more real. And it's necessary to know that in order to orient yourself properly in life. Like, you know, I never really took the idea of good seriously, transcendent good, let's say, or ultimate good, until I convinced myself of the existence of, well, if it wasn't ultimate evil, it was sufficiently ultimate for me, you know, because I immersed myself in the study of the Nazi Holocaust and of what happened in Nanking and what happened with Unit 731, which is the most horrifying, that's the most horrifying material I've ever read, which is really saying something, because there's plenty of horrifying material to read. And what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China, which, you know, so few people know about now. And I guess what I found most striking, especially with regards to what happened in the Soviet Union, was, well, and in Germany for that matter, was that there were a number of people who were writing about it, like Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and also Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote The Gulag Archipelago, which should be required reading for every American citizen. That there was some integral relationship between the moral failings of individuals and the catastrophic moral failings of the state, and that was directly causally related. You know, so Solzhenitsyn made a great case with regards to the analysis of the Marxist catastrophes in the Soviet Union, that they were tied integrally not only to that dogma, but also to the willingness of the typical citizen to swallow endless lies and act them out. And he included himself in that set of deceitful people, let's say. And it really struck me that, because those writings are so profound, Viktor Frankl's another good example. You can't really read that without it really punching you, you know. It really struck me that it was possible that there was some direct integral relationship between the individual moral choices that people made in their day-to-day lives and the broad-scale social movements that happened around them. And I think I've come to believe that that's the case. And well, certainly the story that you read, the person who was written about, the rapist, was making all sorts of individual choices, right? And, you know, he might have been convincing himself that he was on some kind of holy mission, but I guess that would be in part so that he could stand looking at himself in the mirror in the morning without running away screaming if he saw what was really there. So
one of the things in Frankl that kind of, in Man's Search for Meaning, that definitely, two points that really hit me hard when I was reading it was, one is I didn't understand the extent to which the capos, which were the Jewish prisoners that got taken on board to help and would get special treatment. Number one, I didn't realize the extent to which they were in existence. I knew what they were, but I didn't realize that they were as aggressive as they were. And the other thing that hit me is the paragraph or the lines where he's saying that the best of us didn't make it out. Mm. And that if you were going to live, you had to do things that you wouldn't want to maybe do. And maybe if you were a better person, maybe you wouldn't do them. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was harsh. I mean, this was his admitting that if you wanted to survive as a person in that situation, you might have to take someone's piece of bread. You might have to move a number on a list to get someone else sent down to the execution area a day earlier than you, and that happens to postpone your execution long enough that you can make another move, and that's a scary thing.
You know, you saw the same thing with Solzhenitsyn's description of the gulags, because they were run in large part by the inmates. But I think that that's a really good metaphor for totalitarian states in general, you know, because we like to think that a totalitarian state is made up of innocent, oppressed individuals who are under the thumb of an evil tyrant, and that all of the catastrophes are cascading from the top down. But I don't think that that's true. I think that it's more like a holographic structure where the tyranny exists at every single level. So it exists psychologically, and it exists within the family, and it exists within the mid-level organizations. And so, well, you know, in Eastern Germany, for example, 1 out of every 3 people was a government informer. So what that meant is if you had a family of 6 people, that 2 of them you couldn't trust. And you can't just say that that's a consequence of the top-down structure. A tyranny is something that exists everywhere simultaneously once it gets a grip. And it's easy for people to say things like, well, I was just following orders. And, you know, I'm not trying to put myself in a position where I'm claiming that if I was in that position, I wouldn't have followed orders in the same way. I mean, God only knows till you get there, right? That's for sure. But what that did to me was focus my attention more and more on the necessity of individual responsibility. I thought if it was individuals in the final analysis who were responsible for the great evils of the 20th century, which I think is a reasonable way of conceptualizing it, then it might be individuals who could be responsible for whatever good there might be in mankind that could help us avoid those situations in the future. And I thought of that as an alternative in some sense to nihilistic disbelief and ideological possession, you know, because if your group identity is too tight, then you start acting like a cog in a mob. And that's a very bad thing. But then if your group identity disappears completely, well, then you're left alone and bereft. And so those are bad alternatives, right? You're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And it was very difficult to understand that there might be a third path between those two. I couldn't see the existence of anything, because people need belief systems in order to exist, right? To maintain psychological stability and to maintain sociological stability as well. But then if the beliefs get too rigid, then they turn into a raging totalitarian mob. So maybe you let that go because you don't want to play that game, but then you dissolve because you have no identity. That's not acceptable either. When I first laid that out that clearly, it was really hard on me because I couldn't see a third path to that. But then I started to realize, and this was a consequence of reading the sorts of things that we already talked about, but also of starting to understand the underlying structure of mythology and what the heroic path meant essentially, and that meant adoption of supreme moral responsibility as an individual. Now, there's this idea in the New Testament, which is a really interesting idea. You know, it's one of these bottomless ideas, and I mean that literally. You could study it forever and never get to the bottom of it. And the idea is that Christ is the person who takes the sins of mankind on himself, and there's something redemptive about that. And that's actually a really dark idea, because what it means, as far as I can tell, what it means, at least what it means psychologically, is that when you read these terrible things, you have to understand that you're reading about you. If you don't understand that you're reading about you, then you don't actually understand the stories, you know, because you put yourself in the position where you're automatically the good person who would never do anything like that. And then these other people are, well, they're devils in some sense, right? And it's very easy for people to make that division. But it's a horrific realization when you think that that devil that you see outside is the same thing that's inside, and that you don't know until you're put in a situation like that what you might do. And then it's even worse, because if you look at the historical evidence, you know, it was ordinary people in some sense that produced the catastrophes of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and Maoist China. I mean, they might not have originated it, but they certainly had the option to say no at different steps along the way, and they didn't, you know, and these things do happen one horrible thing at a time. There's this great book called Ordinary Men, which describes the descent of of a German police force from ordinary bourgeois middle-class men, essentially just ordinary policemen, who actually were raised before the Hitler Youth. They weren't indoctrinated, as young people, and they were brought into Poland to sort of mop up after the Germans had walked through, and it describes how they descended into the sort of people who would take naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shoot them in the back of the head. And what's horrifying about the book is that the author, Browning, details the stages by which this occurred. And well, for example, the commander of this unit told the men that they were going to have to do terrible things, but that they could go home if they wanted to. And then you think, well, there's an out. But then if you really think about it, you think, well, they're a tightly knit quasi-military organization, and one of the natural thoughts under that circumstance would be, well, I'm not going to leave my comrades to do all the dirty work. That would just be a matter of cowardice. And so you can see that, that there's an ethical requirement that would keep you there to begin with. And then they were...
Well, you're doing what you just said, which is taking the burden of this sinful activity on yourself. If you let everyone else do it, then you're not acting heroically.
Well, right. And so it was easy for the men to get entrapped into that. And then, the requirements for their horrific action kept ramping up. And like each time they accepted the requirement of doing one horrific thing, the probability that they would accept the next requirement increased. And what is also really interesting about that book, Ordinary Men, is that it's not like these men didn't suffer. Like, they were suffering terribly. They were physically ill. They were vomiting. They were tearing themselves apart psychologically, but they didn't quit. So that's a great book, because if you want to know how you walk down how you can be enticed to walk down a terrible path, that's the book to read. And it's very frightening, because if you read it properly, then, you have to read it, again, as I said, as if you're one of the people to whom this is happening. Not the victim, but the oppressor, And, I mean, you can also read it as the victim, that's fair enough, but it's ordinary people who participate in these things, and that's a very, very terrifying thought.